The day you become the first self-made millionaire in your family isn't the day your life changes. It's the day everyone else's does. We've all grown up with the glossy, neon-lit myth of the American dream. We're told that when you finally cross that invisible finish line, there's a bell that rings. There's a party. There's a sudden, weightless feeling in your chest, like you finally escaped the gravity of the struggle. But the truth is much quieter and much heavier. The wire transfer cleared on a random Tuesday. It was 2:14 p.m. The sky outside was a dull, industrial gray, typical of late October in the Midwest. I was sitting at a chipped laminate desk I'd bought at a thrift store 6 years ago, staring at a laptop screen that was held together at the hinge by electrical tape. $1.7 million. For 11 years, I had lived in a state of quiet, manic obsession. I built something out of nothing. It wasn't a glamorous tech startup with a ping-pong table and venture capital. It was a logistics software system. To my family, I was just the kid who sat in the dark staring at code, occasionally coming downstairs to eat cold pizza. They didn't understand what I did, and for a long time they didn't care. They just wanted to know when I was going to get a real job with health benefits. And then, with a single click of a mouse, the struggle was over. Except it wasn't. I didn't open a bottle of champagne. I didn't call my friends. I just shut the laptop, got into my beaten-up 2011 Honda Civic, and drove over to my parents' house. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the engine died with its familiar wheezing sigh. I sat there in the silence, hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching my father. He was 68 years old, his spine permanently curved from 40 years of hauling drywall. He was lying on his back on a flattened, oil-stained Bud Light box beneath his rusty Ford F-150. His knuckles were bruised, his face smudged with black grease as he fought with a rusted-out oil filter. He refused to go to the local Jiffy Lube down the street because they wanted $65 for an oil change. To him, $65 was 3 hours of hard physical labor. It was grocery money. It was electricity. I stood there by my car door, holding a phone in my pocket that contained more money than my father had earned in his entire lifetime. And yet, I couldn't find the words to tell him. How do you tell a man who spent his whole life sacrificing his joints for pennies that you just made a fortune by clicking buttons? My pocket buzzed. I pulled out my phone. It was a text from my older brother, Marcus. "Heard you sold the business. We need to talk." I read it twice. The air in my lungs felt cold. I hadn't told Marcus. I hadn't told my mother. I hadn't told anyone. The deal was private. The lawyers signed non-disclosure agreements. The bank was supposed to be a vault of silence. But in a working-class town, money has a scent. It travels through the walls, carried by whispers, bank clerks who recognize a last name, or a mother who noticed her son's shoulders weren't hunched with anxiety for the first time in a decade. Money is the only secret that tells itself. I slid the phone back into my pocket. My father slid out from under the truck, wiping his greasy hands on a rag that was already saturated with oil. He looked at me, squinting against the late afternoon sun, and gave me a tired nod. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice like gravel scraping together. "You got a 10mm socket in your trunk? Mine's gone missing. Probably rolled into the grass." "Yeah, Dad. I'll look," I said. I walked to my trunk, popped it open, and rummaged through a plastic toolbox. For a few minutes, standing there in the cool autumn breeze, searching for a piece of cheap metal, everything was normal. My dad was just my dad. I was just his son. There was no shadow of $1 million hanging between us. Then my phone buzzed again. "Don't forget where you came from," the text from Marcus read. 2 sentences. The first crack in a glass vase you didn't even know you were carrying. To understand Marcus, you have to understand a night 15 years ago. I was 21, completely broke, and living in a basement apartment where the radiator clanked all night but never actually produced heat. The refrigerator was empty. Not low on groceries empty, but truly, barrenly empty. Just a single jar of yellow mustard and a box of baking soda. I was so hungry my stomach felt like it was digesting itself. Marcus was working double shifts at the warehouse back then. He had a kid on the way, a wife who was stressed to the bone, and barely $100 to his name after rent. But that night, he drove 30 minutes through a blinding snowstorm, walked down my icy stairs, and shoved a crumpled $50 bill into my palm. "Eat something, little brother," he had said, clapping me on the shoulder with a tired, proud grin. "Pay me back when you're a millionaire." It was a joke. It was the kind of throwaway line you say when the future is a vast, empty road and you have nothing but hope to keep you warm. We both laughed. I bought groceries that lasted me 2 weeks. Now, 15 years later, the joke was dead. It had turned into a contract. By the time the weekend arrived, the secret had fully evaporated. It had filtered through my mother, whose joy was so immense she couldn't keep it inside. To her, my wealth wasn't just my success, it was her vindication. It was proof to the neighbors, to her sisters, to the world, that her family had finally made it. So, she did what working-class families do when something monumental happens. She threw a backyard barbecue. When I arrived, the air was thick with the smell of charred burgers and cheap lighter fluid. There were folding chairs scattered across the patchy lawn. My uncle was standing by the grill, deliberately burning the hot dogs because he claimed that's how they tasted best. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in 3 years were running around, their kids splashing through a leaking sprinkler. It was exactly the kind of Saturday afternoon I would have cherished a year ago. But today, the atmosphere was different. The moment I stepped onto the grass, the volume of the yard dipped. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the wind suddenly changing direction. People looked up. They didn't look at me the way they used to. The quiet, struggling kid who was always tired. They looked at me with a strange, guarded curiosity. It was the look you give a stranger who just walked into your living room wearing a suit. Marcus was standing by the cooler, a Bud Light in his hand. He watched me walk up, his expression unreadable. When I reached him, he clapped me on the back. It was a little too hard, a little too performative. "Look who it is!" Marcus shouted, loud enough for the entire yard to hear. "The guest of honor. Careful around this guy, Uncle Jim. He might charge you interest just for breathing his air now." The yard erupted into laughter. It was loud, jovial, and seemingly warm. I laughed along, taking a beer from the cooler, but the laughter felt like a trap. It had the shape of love, the texture of family teasing, but the undercurrent was sharp. It was a preemptive strike. By turning my wealth into a joke, they were making sure I couldn't use it to feel superior to them. They were keeping me in my place before I even had a chance to leave it. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip below the tree line and the string lights flickered on, my cousin Todd slid into the folding chair next to me. Todd was 32, perpetually between jobs, and always talking about the next big thing. He leaned in, his breath smelling of onions and beer. "So, man," Todd said, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "I'm working on this distribution thing. High margin. Just need a little runway to get the inventory off the ground. If you're looking to invest some of that new capital, keep it in the family first, right?" He smiled, but his eyes were dead serious. They were locked onto mine, searching for a flinch, a hesitation. "I'll have to look at the numbers, Todd," I said softly, trying to keep my voice neutral. Todd's smile didn't fade, but it hardened. "Right. Sure. The numbers. Gotta check with your accountants now, I guess." He patted my knee, stood up, and walked away. I looked across the yard and saw Marcus watching us. He didn't say anything. He just raised his bottle in a silent, mocking toast. A joke, I realized, is just how people ask for things they aren't brave enough to demand out loud. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the waiting area of the local Ford dealership. My Civic was in the shop for a recall notice on the airbag, a boring 40-minute chore in a room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. I was staring at a laminated brochure when I looked through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors that led to the sales lot. There was Marcus. He was walking alongside a young salesman in a blue polo shirt. Marcus's hands were stuffed into his pockets, his chest puffed out as he walked down a row of brand-new heavy-duty pickup trucks. The kind of trucks with chrome grills, leather interiors, and price tags that started at $75,000. I watched him. I did the math in my head, the cruel, involuntary math you learn when you study business. I knew Marcus's salary at the warehouse. I knew what his rent was. I knew his wife's car payment. I knew, down to the penny, that Marcus could not afford the monthly payment on a $75,000 vehicle. It would drown him in less than 6 months. But Marcus wasn't looking at the truck's engine. He was looking at his own reflection in the polished black paint of the driver's side door. Suddenly, he turned and saw me through the glass. For a fraction of a second, his face fell. He looked caught. He looked small. But then, a mask of pure defiance slid over his features. He waved me over, his grin returning, wider and louder than before. I walked out into the cold autumn air. "Hey!" Marcus called out, slapping the hood of a massive dual-axle truck. "Perfect timing. Tell this guy this is a beast. I'm thinking about pulling the trigger today. It's time for an upgrade." The salesman looked at me, then at Marcus, sensing a sale. "Your brother's got great taste," the salesman said. I looked at Marcus. His eyes were wild, desperate, and pleading. He wasn't buying a truck because he needed to haul drywall. He was buying a truck because 3 weeks ago his younger brother had become a millionaire, and the gravity of that fact was crushing his sense of self-worth. He was trying to buy back the 3 inches of height he felt he had lost the day my wire transfer cleared. "It's a great truck, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet. "But do you really need the dual axle?" Marcus's grin vanished. The air between us turned to ice. "I don't need you telling me what I can afford," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, loud enough only for me to hear. "Some of us actually work for a living. We don't just sit in comfortable chairs playing with computers." He turned back to the salesman, his voice booming once more. "Write it up. Let's see what the finance department can do." I walked back to the waiting room. My Civic was ready. I paid the $0 recall fee, got in my car, and drove home in complete silence. 2 nights later, Marcus called. It wasn't a text, it was a phone call, which was rare. When I answered, his voice didn't have the sharp defensive edge it had at the dealership. It was soft. It had a strange, hesitant vulnerability that made my stomach twist. It was the voice of the brother who had walked through the snow 15 years ago with a $50 bill. "Hey," Marcus said. "You got a minute? I wanted to run something by you." "Yeah, Marcus, always." "I got this opportunity," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "There's a guy at the warehouse. His brother owns a commercial cleaning franchise. He's looking to sell his territory. It's a sure thing, man. High-end clients, offices, medical buildings. I just need some capital to buy into the contract. 50,000. He paused. The silence on the line was deafening. I could hear his heavy breathing, the faint sound of his television in the background. 50,000, I repeated. "Yeah," Marcus said, trying to sound casual. "Just a short-term loan. I'll pay you back with interest once the monthly invoices start rolling in. It's a real business, you know? A chance for me to finally build something, for my family." He was using my vocabulary. Capital. Runway. Invoices. And then, he dropped the anchor. "I mean, we've always had each other's backs, right? Remember that winter when you couldn't even pay your gas bill? We do what we gotta do for family." There it was, the $50 bill from 15 years ago. It had gained interest. In Marcus's mind, that $50 wasn't a gift of love. It was an option on my future, and now he was exercising it. "Marcus," I said, my heart sinking, "have you seen their tax returns? Have you looked at their client retention rates?" "I don't need to look at a spreadsheet to know a good deal." Marcus's voice flared with sudden ugly anger. "I know the guy, I trust him, but I guess when you get rich, you stop trusting people. You just trust your damn numbers." "Marcus, $50,000 is a lot of money to lose if this franchise is failing." "To me, it's a lot of money," Marcus snapped. "To you, it's pocket change. You just bought a house in the suburbs. You're sitting on a mountain of cash you didn't even sweat for, and you're lecturing me about tax returns? I'm your brother." I wanted to say no. Every business instinct in my body was screaming at me to say no. It was a bad franchise in a saturated market, run by a guy Marcus barely knew. If I gave him the money, it would disappear, and Marcus would still hate me. Perhaps even more, because he would owe me. But I looked at the framed photo on my desk. It was a picture of Marcus and me when we were kids, standing in front of a half-built treehouse covered in dirt, grinning like idiots. "Okay," I said, "I'll wire the money tomorrow." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Marcus didn't say thank you. He couldn't. To say thank you would be to acknowledge the inequality between us. "Yeah, well," Marcus said, his voice rough, "it's a business investment. You'll get it back." He hung up. The deal failed in 4 months. The franchise owner had lied about the medical contracts. He took Marcus's $50,000, paid off his own personal debts, and declared bankruptcy. The warehouse job Marcus had walked away from to run the franchise was gone. He was unemployed, 38 years old, with a mortgage and a family to feed. I didn't bring it up. I never asked about the money. I tried to act like it had never happened, hoping that my silence would protect his pride. But silence doesn't protect pride, it ferments it. A week after the bankruptcy cleared, my mother called me. She was crying. "Why are you doing this to your brother?" she sobbed into the phone. I was stunned. "Mom, what are you talking about? I didn't do anything." "He's losing his house," she cried. "He's drowning, and you're just sitting there in your big house, watching him suffer. He's your older brother. He looked after you when you were nothing. How can you be so cold?" "Mom, I gave him $50,000, I shouted, my own anger finally breaking through the surface. "He lost it on a bad deal. I didn't make him sign that contract." "It was a mistake," she screamed. "People make mistakes, but you have so much now. What is $50,000 to you? It's nothing. You could help him if you wanted to, but you'd rather keep your money than save your family." I stared at the wall of my kitchen. The sunlight was streaming through the window, bright and cheerful, completely disconnected from the rot that was consuming my family. You have so much now. In my mother's eyes, my wealth had redefined my relationship with Marcus. I was no longer his younger brother. I was a resource. I was an insurance policy that was refusing to pay out. My success had stripped me of my humanity in their eyes. I was no longer a person who had worked 11 years of 80-hour weeks, sacrificing my youth and my relationships. I was just a walking pile of cash that belonged to the family. "I can't do this, Mom," I whispered. I hung up the phone. A boundary feels like betrayal to anyone who was counting on your silent compliance. The winter arrived, cold and bitter. The family dinners stopped. The barbecue invitations vanished. When I did see my family at a cousin's wedding or a funeral, the room temperature dropped 3 degrees the moment I walked in. Uncle Jim didn't call me champ anymore. He called me moneybags, with a tight, joyless grin. My mother looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resentment, as if I were a stranger who had stolen her son and replaced him with a banker. The only person who didn't change was my father. He still worked on his truck in the driveway. He still refused to pay $65 for an oil change. He never asked me for a single dollar. He never mentioned the logistics software. When I visited, he would sit with me at the kitchen table for an hour, drinking instant coffee, telling me some rambling, pointless story about a guy he used to work with in the 70s, laughing at his own jokes. He was the only person in my life who still treated me like a human being. Then, on a Tuesday in January, my father had a stroke. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I just remember the sterile white light of the hallway, the smell of rubbing alcohol, and the rhythmic, mocking tick of the wall clock in the waiting room. Marcus was already there. He was standing against the wall, his eyes red and swollen, his jacket stained with grease from the warehouse where he had managed to find part-time work. When he saw me walk through the sliding glass doors, he didn't glare. He didn't make a joke about my money. His shoulders just slumped. For the first time in a year, the wall between us collapsed. There was no $1 million. There was no $50,000 debt. There was no truck. There were just 2 boys in a hospital hallway, terrified of losing their father. I walked up to him, and without a word, I put my hand on his shoulder. Marcus didn't flinch. He leaned into it, his head dropping, and he let out a ragged, silent sob. "He's going to be okay," I whispered. "I don't know, man," Marcus choked out. He looked so small in there. The doctors came out an hour later. The stroke was serious, but they had caught it in time. He was stable. He was awake, but he was weak. They wanted to keep him for a few weeks of observation and physical therapy. Later that night, the room cleared out. My mother and Marcus went to the cafeteria to get some terrible hospital coffee, leaving me alone with my father. He looked incredibly frail beneath the white hospital sheets, his skin almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. His left hand was weak, but his right hand was steady. He turned his head and looked at me, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered. "Hey, Dad," I said, pulling my chair closer to the bed. "You scared us." "I'm too stubborn to die in a hospital," he grunted, his voice weak but clear. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I reached out and took his hand. It felt rough, like sandpaper, covered in the scars of a lifetime of manual labor. "Dad," I said, my voice cracking. "I want to take care of the bills. All of it. The hospital, the rehab, the mortgage on the house. I have the money. You don't have to worry about $65 oil changes ever again." My father looked at me for a long time. His eyes were clear, deep, and filled with a profound, quiet sadness. "I know you have the money, son," he said softly. "But I don't want it." "Why?" I asked, a tear finally escaping and running down my cheek. "Why won't you let me help you? Marcus hates me because I won't give him more, and you won't even let me pay for your hospital bed. Why does everyone have to make this so hard?" My father squeezed my hand. It was a surprisingly strong grip. "You think your business succeeded because you worked hard, don't you?" he asked. "I worked 80 hours a week for 11 years, Dad." "You did," he said, nodding slowly. "You worked like a dog. But do you remember where you got the $15,000 to buy your first server and pay your first year of software licensing?" I frowned. "I got a low-interest personal loan from the local credit union." My father let out a soft, dry laugh that turned into a wheeze. "Credit unions don't give $15,000 loans to 22-year-old kids with no collateral and a basement apartment, son." I stared at him. My heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean?" "The 40 acres upstate," my father said quietly. "Your grandfather's land." The air left my lungs. My grandfather had owned 40 acres of pristine, rugged woodland in northern Michigan. It was a beautiful, wild place where my father had learned to hunt, where he had taken Marcus and me camping when we were kids. It was the only thing my father had ever owned that didn't have a mortgage on it. It was his sanctuary. He had told us 100 times that when he died, he wanted his ashes scattered under the massive oak tree by the ridge. "You sold the land?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I sold it the spring before you launched the software," my father said. "I took the $15,000, walked into the credit union, and put it in a certificate of deposit. Then I told the loan officer to give you a personal loan using my CD as collateral. I made them promise they'd never tell you where the money came from. I wanted you to think you did it on your own. I wanted you to have that pride." I couldn't speak. The tears were coming fast now, hot and heavy. "Why didn't you tell me?" I choked out. "When the deal closed? When the wire cleared? Why didn't you say anything?" "Because if I told you," my father said, his voice cracking with emotion, "then there would be a number between us, just like the number between you and Marcus." I sat in that darkened hospital room, holding my father's rough hand as the entire landscape of my life shifted. For a year, I had been angry. I had been resentful of Marcus's demands, of my mother's emotional blackmail, of my family's silent judgments. I had carried my success like an armor, believing that I had built my tower entirely by myself, stone by brutal stone. But I hadn't. My tower was built on 40 acres of sold land. It was built on the quiet, invisible sacrifice of a father who loved me enough to let me take all the credit, while Marcus, who had given me $50 once, had spent 15 years demanding a lifetime of interest. My father had given me his most prized possession and never even asked for a thank you. 3 weeks later, my father came home. He was weaker, walking with a cane, but his spirit was unbroken. The family didn't magically heal. Marcus didn't pay back the $50,000. My mother didn't apologize for the tears she had cried on the phone. The dinners remained quiet, and the temperature in the room still dropped a little bit when I walked in. Because families don't reset. They don't go back to the way they were before the money came. They just learn the new shape of their relationships, and they carry on. But the resentment in my chest was gone. The scorecard had been thrown away. I no longer expected Marcus to be different. I no longer expected my mother to understand. I accepted them for who they were, flawed, struggling people who were trying to navigate a world that had suddenly changed. It was a Saturday in April. The snow had finally melted, leaving the ground soft and smelling of wet pine. My father's Honda Civic was parked in the driveway. The engine was making a strange tapping sound under the hood. My father came out onto the porch holding his cane, intending to look at it. "Dad?" I called out, walking over. "Get back inside. It's too cold for you out here." "It's just a loose valve cover," he muttered. "The mechanic wants $80 just to look at it." "I've got it," I said. I walked into his garage, found a flattened cardboard box, and laid it down on the damp concrete of the driveway. I slid under the front of the car, the cold metal of the frame hovering inches from my face. The concrete was cold. The smell of old engine oil and rust filled my nose. My hands got dirty immediately, the black grease staining my palms. I looked up through the engine bay and saw my father standing on the porch, watching me. He was holding a cup of hot coffee, a quiet, peaceful look in his eyes. I didn't need to buy him a new truck. I didn't need to force him to accept my millions. Standing there in the cold, with a wrench in my hand and grease on my face, I was finally speaking his language, the only language that mattered, the language of a $10 job.